All right, so we have 1 week of classes left in a final. That's it. And we're done for the summer. Here's what I will say. When I have looked at enrollments for next fall and for the summer, at least in a lot of our classes that I can see, it looks like a lot of our students are not enrolling. And I know part of that may be waiting to see what's happening in the world around us, but I would encourage you, if you haven't enrolled, to get enrolled just so we hold some of those classes open. I know they've already looked at some in the fall and have started looking at which ones they're going to close and not have open. So if you need a class, make sure that you enroll in it, because some of those, not in our school necessarily, but in some of the other ones for gen eds and things, some of those are only taught every other year or every spring or fall, and if they close one, it may be a while to get it again. So make sure you enroll as quick as possible for those. Summer enrollment, it goes by in a breeze. Some of the courses are condensed down to 8 weeks. It's a great way to get that extra hour or 3 or whatever you need out of the way. So continuing on with our idea of business continuity, how do I keep my business running, is the idea of having a recovery site. Another place that we can host all of our information. In some cases, we have it available for employees so that they can have like a call station. So if our business is doing insurance and we have a 500-person call center, do I have an alternative site where I can at least host some of those employees and continue my business operations? So when we look at this, is this expensive to do? Yeah. But I have to base it off of what is my loss of revenue. So if my main building burns down and I don't have an off-site place already ready to go or recovery site, by the time I bring that up, it may be by the time I locate a building, facilities, equipment, I may be 6, 8, 10 weeks out. And if that's where my income is being driven from, it's going to be problematic really, really quickly. So a couple of terms you'll see the idea of a hot site, and typically these are hosted by a commercial company. So companies will say, hey, we have a hot data center for you, so you have an identical copy of your data. And in some cases, because we know that more and more people have those jobs that we can't avoid, there may be some actual seating for employees so that they can work there. One of the great things that's happened, though, in the pandemic is we've learned a lot of these jobs, we can do them from home. And so what you may also have is this site is geared toward that ability to have VPN tunnels, for example, and employees can work for home. So a hot site, everything is there, equipment's there, it's updated, it's ready to go. Literally, we flip a switch and say, all right, we're working on the alternative site. So it's the most expensive to have because you've got internet, you've got all your services provided. So the flip side of that, stupid mouse, come here, is a cold site. So a cold site says, well, we have space, we don't have backups immediate, it's much cheaper, but it takes longer to resume that business operations. So we have to think about what are our critical operations. What in our business, if we went down, we had a tornado, we had a fire, what do we need to duplicate immediately? What can we duplicate in a week? How do we start to get those operations back up and running? So, and there are sites that are in between that have different facilities you can rent out, you can purchase. So some companies will actually purchase a spot in a co-location center. So a co-location center is kind of a data center that you rent space in. So it's not typically owned by Google or Verizon, but you rent space or services in that co-location center. So for example, there's a company called Binary.net that operates here in our state, and they have a data center located in the building my wife works in downtown Lincoln. It's a couple floors of it, and you rent space. So you can rent connectivity, you can rent space, so you'd have hot servers. And a lot of companies look at it as, this is a great way to do something we'll look at in the future called backups. Backups are good, our data gets backed up there, and then it's ready to roll immediately. Here's the problem. Our main data site gets destroyed. Here we moved to our ulterior site, which was formerly serving as our backup site. What are we going to do about backups and some recovery there? So we need that plan in place of what happens, how do I proceed, and how do I move into getting all these things back up and running. So again, this is cheaper. The less services, the less things ready to roll, the cheaper. So in the middle is this idea of something called a warm site. And that warm site's really defined by you, how much stuff is available. So maybe we don't have an active internet connection. We have to immediately lease one. And business internet's certainly more expensive than your home internet, so it does cost more. So maybe it makes sense to not have that turned on all the time. So we have to think about our business and our needs. What is the maximum time frame we can be out of service? If we're, for example, that insurance agency, and there's a natural disaster, are we also going to have customers that are going to be in the same issue immediately? Yeah, so maybe we need to come back up quicker. On the other hand, if we're a lawn care service, maybe the billing and everything is a little less. We can delay some of that and continue to work a little later. Well, the other piece that makes some of this interesting now is the reliance on cloud computing applications. In other words, they're stored on somebody else's server that you may not know about or where it's at, but we don't have to maintain some of these pieces. For example, Blackboard. There's two models for Blackboard. You can host your own Blackboard. So you've got the software here, you've got the storage, the servers, and that's one model. But now we store a lot of that stuff on the quote-unquote cloud. So in this case, those services or software as a service, if our business goes down, all we really need is a chair and an internet connection. So a lot of companies, as we move to this actually works as a really good way for backup. We're storing our data online. If something happens, I can literally sit in a hotel and bring up my QuickBooks, for example, and I can still know where my business is at. So the biggest piece of this is data. What do we do with our data? So data backup, some way to store it. And so all these things we have stored on our servers, we have to have some way to back it up. We also need to be able to have backups. Typically, we'll back up in intervals. So every day, every hour. Because what happens on our server? So we get ransomware. Ideally, we have a data restore point. We can wipe everything out and go back a day or a week or whatever our tolerance is, and we can start over. So we can wipe out the bad data before we got ransomware. You haven't got, and that actually happens quite a bit. And so that's one of the reasons we do those snapshots, so we have points in time so that we can go back, because that has happened. We backed up, we got all our data secured, we thought, and we already had been infected by that point. So it is something we need to think about. So we need to see what kind of data we have, how much data we have, what type of backup we want to use. And one of the most important ones is this idea of off-site backup. Great, I can plug in an external hard drive onto my computer at my house like this, only it's in a little box, and I can back up everything on my computer. What happens if my house burns? There's no way that data is recoverable now. And a lot of businesses fall prey to that. They go, well, we back up everything on a flash drive. Well, when I hear that, I immediately cringe, because flash drives are unreliable, and you're relying on that human to sit there and do a backup. And that's always bad. The other piece I think we need to think about in backups is it has to be automated. If it's not automated, if you are depending on a human to intervene and force a backup every day or every week or whatever it is, at some point it's not going to get done. And the law of karma says it's not going to get done the point in time you need it. So I have an example of this. I work with a small city, and they have a billing system, and they've got about 4,000 clients on there. Well, they called me one day out of the blue and said, we have a problem. We can only see 25 clients on our database now. And I went, Well, not a problem, because it was like a Monday, and I know that, hey, we'd arranged that they're supposed to be backing up every Friday. Great, we'll roll back to Friday. So I went down there and said, oh, let's do. Wait a minute. Where's this person? Oh, she's on vacation for the last 3 weeks. Did somebody else take her job? Did she show them how they were supposed to back up? Because at this time I had not yet gotten into their head that they needed some kind of a scheduled backup and that it needed to be automated. And they were actually having to go back and pop a drive into an external enclosure, back it up, and then they took it to a safety deposit box. So at least it was getting out of the building, except the person in charge of that's been gone the last 3 weeks. So now instead of 1 day's worth of business, they're out a month. And that's a lot of data. So they didn't have data for everybody that got billed, 4,000 plus customers for gas, water, sewer, and electric. Now, luckily, I was able to go in and actually manually intervene in the database, and I was able to get their customer list back up and find all this data and restore it. But it was not a cheap process. And so the timing was great because it happened to be during the summer when I had some time available and I needed some income. The timing was also great for this reason, which I love the law of karma. I had just installed power at my shop the week before. And what I had to do was put up a fairly large deposit for what was really going to be just a storage building for rolls of cabling and electronics. But I needed power in there. So had the electrician out, they powered it up, and then the city said, well, you need a $4,000 deposit because it's a commercial electric. Now, I will point out in the years since then, it has never been more than $30 a month for service. But that was their written rule. So when I came back in and they said, we don't see any customers, I said, I already know what your bill is going to be, at least, before I leave here. As it turns out, it was pretty close, honestly, because we spent a lot of time getting it because there wasn't that idea of backup. Since then, that triggered them to think, oh, hey, let's listen to you and do some automated backups. If you have a person involved, it is a crappy backup. Let's just say that right now. So part of what we need to think about is, how long can we tolerate between backups? So if I'm a fairly large company with a lot of data being input, I don't want to miss a whole lot of time, because if I have to go back and recreate all that data, it may be hard or impossible, and it's a lot of employee time. So different businesses, so small company in Auburn, they may be able to go a week because they've had like 10 tickets there. So a small plumbing company, oh, we could go back a week and probably have the hand tickets and put it all back into QuickBooks. On the other hand, if I have 100 people in there inputting data every day in a credit card servicing center, I'm not going to go back a week. That would be horrific. So how long can we spend between backups? And we also need to think about how long it's going to take to get that data recovered. So between when we lose it and reinstall data, reinstall servers, whatever it is, that length of time. Because both of those play a role in what kind of systems and how much we're going to spend on it. Think about Amazon. If Amazon's website crashed, can they afford to be down for a day or two or three? No. That's a ton of revenue. So their ability to recover, they're going to certainly spend more money. Think about Blackboard for us. If Blackboard's down for 15 minutes, it's an inconvenience because we know it's going to go down right when you're trying to type your paper. There's a law about that. But it's not a major inconvenience. The world isn't going to come to an end. However, it's down for 2 weeks at the end of a semester. Is that going to be a problem? Yeah, so we need to be able to resolve that and get back in as quick as possible. So we need to think about an architecture for this backup. And we have a couple of different things ways we can do that. So the best way, in some weird ways, is what we call a full backup. We take everything, we scoop up all that data, and we back it up. Here's the problem. In a business, it may take 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 hours or however long it takes to get all that data backed up. Well, that may be okay on a weekend, so we could pick Saturday and do a full backup, but each day of the week, we're not down long enough to do that. We need to figure out a way to back that data up, and there's two different ways. So, differential and incremental. And the biggest difference between them is how many files are needed to get that data back. So, differential says, I did my big full backup, and every day then, I do a backup of everything that's changed. So it's a much smaller file, but so Monday, maybe it's 100 megs. Tuesday, then that differential gets to 200 and 300 and 400. So my file sizes get bigger, but I only need the full backup and the differential. So I have less chance of something happening weird to that backup because I only have 2 files. So, but depending on the size of that, an incremental backup may work better. Because an incremental says, okay, I've got my full backup on Saturday, and then I do what's changed on Monday. And then what's changed from Monday to Tuesday, I have another backup, and then another one the next day. And so I have an entire set of files. So the files are smaller on those incremental backups, and I have my full backup, but I need all of them to get the difference back. So honestly, if I'm doing a full backup on a week, I tend to like differentials, just because then I only have the full backup and a file that says, all right, I have everything for that entire week in one file. Because what I've ran into before with different software is these incremental backups, if one of those is corrupt, it screws up the backup and we lose some data. So it's just my personal preference. So there is also now some other backups that are coming, and these have really been, since we've had virtualization makes our life easier. Because if I think about a typical server that's running an email program like Exchange, I really have to somehow stop that Exchange server, grab data, and then restart that Exchange server, because that data is moving around in there, and I need to make sure I get all of it. Well, now that we have virtualization, I can take snapshots or do continuous data. So instead of just at the end of the day when everybody's kicked out, I do backup, I'm doing backup literally continually all day long. And so the most common setting I actually have set up is about every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes it takes a snapshot of that virtual image and says, here we are. And if we need to go back, it's almost like turning the dial back on a clock and saying, oh, I need to go back to 3 o'clock. Boom, and I can do that really quickly. So continuous data backup, there are pieces of software that will do that on non-virtualized hardware. So we're going to go spend some money and do it. In theory, Microsoft Backup does it, but it fails most of the time when I've tried to pull data back out of it. So continuous data gives us that timeline, which is really pretty handy. So we can back up to a specific point. So I know that Mark out there, he got ransomware, and he called right away. He said, I shouldn't have opened this email, and I know I have administrative privileges, and I probably shouldn't, and it installed itself. And we can go, oh, you did that at about 1:39. I'll back everybody up to 1 o'clock. We scrub that malware off our system, and hopefully, now some of it's getting a little more complicated and sophisticated, but in great theory, that's a great way to do data. So this is kind of the ultimate model of data. But what I will say is, in addition to that, I typically like full backups anyway. And in addition to just a backup of the data, I actually like to do what's called a bare metal backup. In other words, I back up everything on that physical box as a snapshot in a couple of different points in time. And that's typically a manual model. But I back up everything, so if I need to restore that server because 3 or 4 hard drives die at once, I replace them, I can do that very easily. So it just gives me that peace of mind. I can sleep at night, and my name doesn't get tossed around like it did in Beatrice when they got hit with malware, and it took the city down for 3 weeks. So here's where we come to some more decisions. Where do we store that data? Well, obviously storing it next to the server in the data closet means if we have a fire, a flood, a theft, that data isn't very secure. So we almost always have to have some way to take that off-site. So the traditional model is somebody in the business takes the tapes or the drives or however we're backing up and takes it off-site and stores it in a safe. That works. It's got a couple of issues for me. One, you have to depend on a person again. And two, now you're moving your data unsecurely. So I have all this entire backup of everything I own, and, well, Mark, we'll make fun of Mark in there again. Mark is the one that's charged with taking it down to the bank, but he doesn't even lock his car doors, leaves the key in the ignition, somebody steals his car. Now I have to report that we've lost all of our data because we weren't really smart, and one of the things that we also need to add is all those backups need to be encrypted so that even if somebody does steal Mark's car with that data in it, they can't get to it. All right, so the most common model is something called a 3-2-1. So we have 3 different kinds of backups on 2 different types of media, and one of them at least has to go off-site. So typically the 3 that I like to advocate for are these. I will do some kind of an off-site backup to a cloud storage. Somebody like Backblaze, Amazon Web Services. There's a whole list of them out there. I encrypt my data, and I use some kind of backup tool that will push that out encrypted, and I try to deduplicate or take out all the duplicated data as much as possible because off-site storage is expensive at the business level. You can get the Carbonite for your home use, and it's like $10 a month. But when I start storing business data, it gets pretty expensive. The next backup I like is right there in that data center. I like to have typically now spinning drives or some kind of hard drives that it backs up immediately to. That way I have access to that data very quickly. And one of the downfalls to sending that data out in the cloud is pulling it back. If I have 60 terabytes of data to pull back, that's days and days. So I will also work with an offsite provider that will overnight me a hard drives or set of drives containing all that data so I can get it back quickly. My third one is also I typically like to go off-site. But I go off-site locally. And a lot of organizations have this available. So they have multiple sites on their campus or they have multiple locations. And so I do another backup, but hopefully I'm connected with fiber, and I can do that kind of in a middle speed. So I can still get my backups pretty quickly, but it gives me an off-site place to store that data. Does it make sense to do it 4 or 5 or 6 places? Sometimes it does. The more copies of that data, as long as it's encrypted and you can get it back, the safer you are. Because weird things do happen. Weird things do happen. So continuous data, great. So typically, I'm going to find some software that I'm going to back this all up with. So if I'm using virtual, typically I'll use something like Veeam, and Veeam can allow me to set this data and push it out to about anywhere. Or if I've got bare metal, the one I typically use is something called Backup Exec, because it'll let me set data and put it anywhere, including other data centers. So maybe I back up to Backblaze or one of these sites, but I may also look at, does my internet service provider offer a backup site that I can also rent out space in? Sometimes I back up immediately in my own data center. So I will do something like, if you've seen a bigger data center, one of the companies that does a lot of stuff is HP. And so I really like something called a 3PAR system from HP. So here's my big storage drives. That's how I connect all my virtual machines, my storage. And then I will use something like a store once. So as soon as that data hits the original drives, I have a copy of it immediately. From there, it then sets out to multiple locations so that I can get it back. And I have used like those store once devices in some areas where we had fiber connectivity. We could lease a fiber from one building to another across town. And so sometimes I've talked businesses into doing kind of a fiber lease, and then they swap. So a hospital and maybe a business downtown that's a significant distance away, they will put backup servers in each other's data centers, and that way we can do that at a fairly economical rate. It's still expensive. Backup is not cheap. But the question is, how long can your business be down? How long can we be down? So my PSC, we do automatic backups, and they go from one hot site to another hot site automatically. So there's 2 sites available at all times. It's a one-way we have that business continuity. So this is that 3-2-1 plan or more is always a good idea. If somebody is backing up to one device only, there's generally an issue. And we have to think about what's going on with that company and with that organization. If they're backing up manually by hand with somebody handing a flash drive and say, hey, back up my files for me, that's not very secure. There's a lot of cloud services out there you can use as a small business. If you're buying, for example, Office 365, it comes with a terabyte of storage. Use it for your Office documents. We won't talk about its security and some other issues, but it's better than them sitting on a local desktop and getting deleted. So the cloud brings up some new, interesting legal issues for us, though. We don't always know where that cloud data is stored. Some states, some countries have different laws regarding data and what can and cannot be stored there. Great. So, and it's not necessarily that data is bad, but they may have different privacy restrictions. So, if I tried to take my data from the hospital over here in Auburn, and I said, I'm going to store that in a server in Germany, they're going to let me, I'm probably going to run into problems because they have a much tighter set of privacy laws than we have here. So we do have to be aware of what that is. So if you have content that may be controversial, so think about our social media platforms. There's certainly differences in how countries apply privacy rights to speech, and so you might have issues that way. So that cloud services provider, you typically need to make sure that it matches what your data is being stored as. So even though we're going to encrypt it, if you're encrypting medical data, make sure they say, hey, we're HIPAA certified. If we're storing educational data, there better be in that service contract something about FERPA. If we're processing credit card data, they better have in there PCI compliant. So we need to make sure that data that we're storing in the appropriate place. Jim Bob's house of hard drives is probably not going to be really very effective. And in fact, one of the dangers of any of these cloud organizations, what happens if they close their doors? If that's your only backup and they close their doors, yikes. And there are companies that do that. They change their business model. They run out of money. They closed for whatever reason. Even Google, we think of that as a giant company. How many programs have they dropped and said, we're abandoning this, we're going to go to somewhere else? So that cloud backup is good. If that's all you're relying on, you're really kind of putting your eggs in a shaky basket. You need a couple of different options with that backup. The closer to my data center, the faster I can get that data back. Obviously, the internet is the slowest way to get that data back off of those servers. One of the worst things we have is the idea of fire. And so our server closets are actually kind of dangerous. So in most cases we have batteries. So if you looked at this device, wherever it is on here, that UPS, it's got a fairly good sized lead acid battery in it. Well, in our data closets, we have huge stacks of batteries. They can and have been known to explode, catch on fire. The servers are running continually. Fans die, things overheat, have been known to catch on fire. What do we do about that? So fire suppression in that data closet is a little bit of an issue. Typically, we have to have a wet fire suppression system. So I have a lot of electricity and I have a lot of electronics, and now I'm going to dump water into it. Oh, great. So I need to think about that a little bit. How else can I prevent fire and suppression? And so there are some new systems. So typically a fire needs heat, it needs fuel, and it needs oxygen. Well, there are fire suppression systems. So the old term used to be halon, and now they've changed it to all kinds of new ones. There's FM2000 and several others. They take out the oxygen and smother a fire. Here's the problem. What if you're in that server closet? So most of them have some requirement. So you'll see labels and signs outside the doors stating that kind of fire suppression system's there. And so we will typically have some rules about how long you can stay in there, whether you can go in there with the doors completely closed. There are newer ones that actually have a thermal camera and detect body heat and will not fire off if they see a body heat image. So there's some ways around it. But in the old style system, great, I saved my whole system. I dumped halon in there, but I killed 3 employees because they were in there working in that closet. So it's something to be aware of. If you see the system go off, obviously run out the door as quick as possible and don't do anything dumb. Your buddy's laying there on the ground because there's no oxygen. Don't go back in after him. So we need to come up with plans for how to deal with that. So that's, again, part of that. You still may end up with an old school place where they force you to. The fire marshals may say, you know what, we need to have wet suppression in there. I actually saw one not too long ago. They were forced to have wet suppression. IT guy was up there in the data closet and working up above, trying to. They typically have ladder racks and equipment. Hit his head on a sprinkler and knocked it off. Millions of dollars in damage immediately. So those are the kinds of things you need to be aware of. So if you see wet sprinkler heads like we do in here, run. Those things are typically pretty dangerous, at least for our electronics. They do save the building. The other way you can do it is there are some of those systems that are slightly different. So these have water all the way on that head every moment of the day. So it's a flooded system. There are ones that have a valve that's automatically controlled and don't have water in the pipes until the alarm goes off. And so sometimes you can use those systems and at least gain a little bit of time before you take out your electronic equipment. So other things that can happen. So our servers have a lot of data. And one of the things we're noticing is there are some weird bit flips now. And we're seeing them in a lot of software. As we run more and more and more data, we have these odd bit flips. And so there's a couple of things we can do. We make sure that our servers run what's called error checking memory or parity-based memory. So it kind of does a double check. But we need to avoid building next to very large electrical devices, transformers, those kinds of things that can cause EMF. So fluorescent lights, some of them used to be really bad. Maybe you decided to build your data center next to your boiler room where you have a 10-horse pump sitting right beside the servers. It's not a great plan. So if I can get rid of EMF, one of the other ways I do it is I actually turn my building or that server closet into what's called a Faraday cage. In other words, I essentially line it with a metal grid, and that grid drains off that EMF. It's really the same reason you're safe in a car during an electrical storm, as long as you don't touch the metal of the outside of the car, because that drains around the car. It's not the rubber tires. It's actually that metal skin of the car. Makes it much safer. So now the downside to this, there's a door there, or a table. The downside of this is you do that, you have no cell phone signal in there. So if you're counting on a cell phone signal for some kind of issue, you're going to be mounting antennas outside of the server closet because it will wipe that out. On the other hand, there are times it's nice to go in someplace like that where your phone says there's no signal, you're not going to get text, you're not going to get phone calls. So your server room may be the place to relax in some ways. So that's pretty typically in industry. So if we have any kind of electric equipment, one of those things we need to do. And then we have that idea of cooling it. So these servers will typically put out a lot of heat. So as they're running, it is not uncommon for a rack of servers to put out as much or more heat than your entire furnace at your house. We have to have a way to dissipate that. Well, there's a couple of issues. We put our server rooms, typically we try to put them in the very center of our building to minimize distance and cabling and also make it more secure. So we'll put an air conditioning system up on the roof, right? Does your typical air conditioning system run in the middle of winter? No. So you have to buy special equipment that will actually run. So they actually have heaters to melt the air conditioning condensers out so that they can run in the middle of winter. So your HVAC systems are a little more expensive. Typically, they also have humidity controls so that the humidity stays at a decent level in there, because as we're cooling, one of the things we do is reduce the humidity. And you've seen it here. You walk across the room and you sit at the window and it snaps back from the door or something. Well, you really don't want that in your server closet. That can be kind of dangerous. So you pay a lot of money to get HVAC systems that maintain temperature, humidity, and can do it in the middle of the winter. So 2009, I got involved in a project down in Falls City down there where we had built a new hospital, and it was over Thanksgiving weekend. We transitioned from old hospital to new hospital. I had never realized there was that many steps to this, but it went pretty well until Monday came around. Monday, there's a giant snowstorm. Server closets tucked on the inside. Nobody's in it because they're running around trying to hook up phones and everything else, and it was generally a chaotic mess. But all of a sudden, the nurse call system, so those buttons on every patient room that'll say code blue or I need help or whatever else, that system went down. And I was like, oh, that's not good. So myself, because I was on board there with trying to help get everything done, and one of the techs there at the hospital hired directly, we went back, we opened up the server closet, and it was like a wave of hot air. So it was at least 130, 140 degrees in that room, hot enough that it turned off most of the equipment. But wait, we have brand new HVAC systems, right? Well, unbeknownst to us, they had not properly got the heaters installed and turned on. They were packed with snow and ice up there. So, middle of a snowstorm, we're overheating the server closet. Great. So, we had to come up with some new plans and ways to do that worked a little better. The other thing we figured out fairly quickly also was in the backup power plan for this building. We had UPSs for all of the server equipment. Those worked really well. The backup generator that was supposed to also power that could power all the servers, but they did not get one big enough to power the HVAC systems. So you could run a limited amount of time before your server closet was going to overheat. So they had to make some changes. So it's a learning curve. There were things we thought we had figured out. We went live probably way too quick, and that's one of the weird things in that healthcare was we didn't have enough money to transition all the equipment and buy all brand new. So it was how do I get this up and running? And we ran into those. So when something happens, how do we have that response? What do we do? So typically, most businesses are going to have some kind of an incident command center. So there will be different people, like managers of the day at a casino or something, that have responsibilities once they're notified of some kind of an incident. And so you will have a plan of, hey, we lost the nurse call system. This is our plan. We lost electrical in the surgery. This is our plan of what we're going to do. So the other piece we have then, so we're talking about how to deal with life in our business, is the idea of forensics. And you've heard that, and you've seen it on CSI and all these shows, all this computer forensics, which most of that is sped up, made up, and isn't realistic. But with our technologies, we need to think about how are we going to respond to incidents on our campus. So we've got cameras now on our campus here. What if we have a sexual assault on campus? Do we have a procedure for that? What if we have a student that Janae looks over, I'm gonna, and Bobby's over here looking at child porn on his computer. Do we have a procedure for that? And we've had issues. So many years ago, I had an advisee, apparently had a proclivity for looking at or producing, or how it was pretty horrific, child pornography. He's in this building. The only way we knew about it, and I knew about it, was because he happened to live in the same town I did, and I read the newspaper and saw that he'd been arrested on federal charges for thousands of images of child pornography. He was my advisee. What do you do? His release conditions on bond were he could not use a computer anywhere except at the college he was going to. And he's in here in this computer lab where he's one floor above a daycare. Do you think that caused some issues? Yeah. And while I monitor to some degree, do we know exactly what you go to on your computer? I can find it out eventually, but we don't have any kind of anti-child porn filters on there. We don't record everything automatically everywhere you go. It became an issue. And so it went to the central office. And part of that was, well, he's not been convicted yet. We don't really have the ability to change any of that. Think about you're running a company and one of your sales guys maybe has something incriminating on a laptop. Or you think your accountant is embezzling. So I threw out the child porn one because that still freaks me out, and that's been 10 years ago that we had a guy here on campus doing that behavior. What are we going to do? We have an accountant, we think they're stealing money from us. What does the IT department do? What is their role in there? What do we need them to do? So one of the things that we have now is we have more and more digital evidence everywhere. However, to get that evidence and to get it into court, we need to look at a couple of things. So we need to have, and as horrible as it sounds, we need to think about every possible scenario. How do we secure that data? How do we secure those records? How do we secure that individual in some cases? So we have to be prepared as a business to do this. Now, first response on something like child porn, we're going to call the State Patrol, right? Because honestly, Auburn has a great law enforcement center, but what would they do if we found child porn? Call the state to come in because they don't have a cyber investigative unit. But even before that point, we need to make sure we don't violate any of these. If we have an accountant that we think has been stealing, or we're a financial, we're in fintech, and we think there's been a disclosure of important information. So we need to have that reporting system. So a cyber response, what team, who's going to be involved? Who's going to be involved in a fire team? So it all kind of bundles together in our incident response plans. Who do we report these issues to? Do we report them? Hey, we had a student who downloaded some questionable material. Do we turn that in? If we need to figure out those questions, and it certainly becomes an issue. And then a lot of cases we do like tabletop or actual in-person exercises to try to do that. So hopefully we never have an issue on our campus where we really have to secure a crime scene for something like a student or a faculty or employee does something really horrible. But even in cyber crimes, we still need to secure that evidence. And we need to establish that chain of custody so that it is known who has it when, and has anybody touched it. Because if that evidence, we don't have that chain of custody, and I'm gonna throw you under the bus, Bobby. All those child porn episodes that you've been looking at on my computer, well, now you just got to get out of jail free card because we can't throw it into court. So we need to think about these in terms of how do I establish some of that. So typically we're going to go to the police, or if we're a larger company, or even here we have our own security team. So we may need to confront somebody and say, hey, stop on your computer now. Put it down. So we don't want anybody to hurt anybody else. So that's when I have to tackle you to the ground because I see that you have a homemade shiv because, as a college student, you're too poor to buy your own knife. You had to make one, right? So if we grab that equipment, and one of the things that we can do is typically we'll grab, for example, your cell phone, and we'll put it into a Faraday bag. That way you can't remotely wipe that phone or remotely wipe that device. If we're a large company, we probably have these things available. Here, well, we better hope the State Patrol arrives pretty quickly, right? So we can certainly, though, take pictures, make sure everything is labeled. So the cyber team's typically going to come in and they're going to arrest you, or at least detain you for a while. They're going to grab everything. They'll interview witnesses. Maybe it's a theft where you have to bring in a forensics auditor to come in and start looking at it. So all of these things, though, we have to have them labeled. They have to be done correctly, because if we don't, it becomes an issue. And so preserving the evidence. So one of the things I hope we can do in the future, and we've been talking about it, is do a digital forensics course, and where we actually have more time to go through and look at some of those. So digital evidence, they use the word fragile because it really is. And it's subject to change. And one of the things is that we need to make sure that that data doesn't change. So data off of our computer. Leave the computer running. Leave the phone. In fact, even if you put it in a Faraday cage, it's a good idea to use like one of those power banks and plug it in so it stays charged. Because that way, data that when your computer resets, that volatile data, we can actually preserve that. Typically we grab that first, and then we're going to look at things like on your hard drive. And that hard drive we're going to look at, we're going to use some kind of a tool. So typically we have a write blocker, so we've got a physical device that this plugs into, and that device will allow me to read it but not write to it. And we take a copy of this drive. We capture the entire thing, and we have a copy we work with. We don't actually examine the data that's on the live drive. So we use a tool, we pull off a forensically valid copy of it, and then we can start examining that, and we're not tearing up the original data. So it's one of the keys that we have. Now, we have some problems, though. And one of the problems we have is establishing, especially data now, on these. So the solid-state drives. On a hard drive, it writes this to our file, and it just sits there. These guys actually have software that will sit there and randomly move data around to avoid wear on some of the little transistors in there. So it's been some effort for them to consider a copy of this equivalent to a copy of a hard drive like this. And I know that's a little weird and probably a little more technical, but they have argued that when we made a copy of this, because that data can rotate and move to protect this drive from wearing out, that means that data is not the same. And so we need to make sure that that is all done correctly, dotted to an I and to a T. So typically there's going to be some chain of custody paperwork. So nobody can corrupt it. We know who's touched it, when they've touched it, what they did to it. And then we're going to search through that data. And we're going to typically search through your files first. Those are pretty easy to get to. We got a copy of those. And then we're going to look at other places. So we're going to look at pictures. Did you store data in pictures? And depending on what the crime is, we may have some other clues about what you're going to do or where you're doing it. So on this hard drive, it says it's 36 gigs or whatever size it is. It's actually bigger than that. There's some extra spots on this drive. And if you're really smart and clever, you can write data to those. And it's very hard to get to. It's typically not accessible. So we're going to look at those spots. Because even on these, there are pieces that wear out. Well, the drive automatically says, oh, well, I have a couple extra pieces over here I can grab for data. So those investigators are pretty thorough. They're going to go through that data. They're going to look for images. They're going to look for things that don't look right. So here we may have extra information. This file, this is one of the areas we talk about slack space. That file doesn't take up this entire chunk of data, or that what we call a cluster, or how it's stored. So there's space at the end of it. We can't make a smaller piece, so there's some space in there that doesn't get used. But we can put information, just like we did on the OpenPuff. We can store information in those extra spaces that don't get used up. And so we can store all kinds of goodies in there. So on the drive, you can have the same thing. So your computer doesn't actually store all of that. So we have some extra space and locations we can do it. You can encrypt it. And in fact, one of the things I would say after taking this class already I'd probably fail Bobby right away now because he wasn't smart enough to encrypt it with something that the police couldn't break, right? Of course, when they're breaking your thumbs, you probably will give up that password pretty easily. Yep. See, I didn't even make fun of you and use you on that example, dude. So, there's a lot of things we can do. So we might look back over server logs. We might look at logs coming off of our firewalls then, depending on what has happened in our company. So when we have had incidents on our campus, and so a not very good moment was many years ago, we had a student go missing, still gone, presumed murdered, or he's actually been convicted of that. But one of the things they did was they searched through emails, trying to see if they could find information. They tried to search his phone because there's a lot of information out there, and we can use it for a lot.
They pinpointed the accuracy based off of what
Did they? Then they also tracked him, and now you can actually get, as a law enforcement agency, you can apply for a subpoena. And so we had some horrible incident on our campus. You can now actually ask Google to find all records of people that have interacted with Google in a geo-fenced area. And so that's led to several things in California, for example, where people lit fires, and we were able to narrow, or they were able to narrow it down enough to figure that out. So if you think you got a chip in your vaccine, you're probably wrong, because we don't need to get one in your arm, because you're carrying around your own tracking device. So depending on how paranoid you are, how much you turn your phone on, here's the scary part. Some of the tracking software, when your phone is off, actually still works. They're also used for some interesting purposes. So the state of Missouri uses it along I-70. So you just drove on I-70. It's very crowded between Kansas City and St. Louis, unless you drove at like 3 in the morning, and then it's still not as bad. They actually use cell phone data to figure out how many people are on that road. Huh. Do they tell you about that? No. And I don't think they're the only one. That's come out in a Freedom of Information Act request. So they have actually started using location data. So ICE has been one that's been able to get location data, not from the phone companies directly, but through an intermediary who buys all the data from the phone companies and will sell it to government agencies or really anybody who's got a dollar, and we'll use that for location data on people, places, and things. So there's good things about it, there's bad things. If we're trying to recover our data, trying to recover our money, trying to cover whatever it is, it's probably good. On the other hand, if you really think about what the privacy you have given up by using your smartphone all day long, it's pretty tremendous. All right, so make sure you have posted in the discussion board. Remember, this week you can get some extra credit for a missing assignment. The bigger the lie, the better the lie. All right, go watch a baseball game. Oh, okay, watch the second game. Did we win? All right, perfect. Perfect. All right. Get out of here. I will see you guys next Tuesday. And that's your last week. 2 more days.